so darn cheap, I wouldn't have ordered so damn much of it. That was my grandfather. That was Paris Kayla. And he was born probably about 1820.
That's very good. Remind me now, what was that one you were telling me before about, I think it was how Beals Island got electricity?
Well, about, I would say now, this would have been the 1800s. There's two families in, you're going to hear a lot about, being in Washington County at the moment, you're going to hear a lot about the Morses and the Beals. And the Morses and the Beals have been around here for God knows how long, probably since the very beginning of time in Washington County and in the Jonesport and Beals Island area. Now in Jonesport, that was where the Beals were established, and they're a very powerful family, very especially in the 1800s. Back in those days, Barney Beal was the head of their family. And for a time he was the governor of Maine and a town selectman in Jonesport. And Beals Island, just over, he wasn't a big fan of Beals Island, not just for the, you would have thought he liked it after it's named after him and all, but he wasn't too fond of that country because of the people who lived there. And there was one family in particular, there was the Morses, and Barney Beal, he didn't like the Morses too good for a variety of reasons. Now, the Morses, there was Cecil Morse. I won't tell you about the Beals' ancestry because I've told you all about that before, but the Morses, there was Cecil Morse, and he met Mary Morse, who was an Irish woman, on a boat. And they were sailing out there. They came back to Beals Island, and God, that's odd. They came back to Beals Island, and they had 4 kids, or at least 4 kids. I know they had 4 sons. There was Don Morse, and there was Marshall Morse, and there was Tim Morse, and there was Kendall Morse. Now, Don and Marshall were the biggest boys in all of Beals Island, And Don was a good, strong fella, hard-working too, and Marshall was a bit more of a nuisance, He didn't quite have the brains you would hope a man of his stature would have. A bit of a brute, a bit of a nuisance in that island, in that town. And the whole Washington County heard about Marshall Beals' exploits. There was one time he got in a fight with some Gloucester fishermen down the docks one night after a lot of drinking, and the Gloucester fishermen, one of them ended up pulling up a rifle on him. And instead of turning heel and running, Marshall just grabbed the barrel of that rifle, turned it right back around at them, bent it like that. And so everyone heard about the Morses after that. And Tim Morse wasn't quite as notable as any of the others. He was just a town drunk, drank about a quarter of whiskey every day of his life. When he died, he asked to be cremated. So the preachers, when he died, they said, well, best abide by his wishes and cremate him. It took about 3 days to put the fire out. But Kendall Morse, he was a very smart boy. They remember, even when he was 8 years old, he was getting out of his cot and messing with machinery around the homestead, and they knew he was too smart for his own good, but then they were stuck with him. Now there came a time, of course, Barney Beal, being a very influential man in the town, he had a lot to say about the employment and the employment offers of the town, what jobs people were allocated, and that it eventuated out, I think this was sometime after the incident with the fishermen, that Marshall Morse, he went up to him, handed him a train ticket, and he gave him a job which had him sent down to South Hiram. Pretty much sent him right out of town. He never came back. No. But he did have some good strategies with the Morses. Of course, at first he sent Don up to a good job, fixed him up with a job in, I think, as a foreman, working with the infrastructure of the town. So he gave Don a good job for being so hard working, but Marshall was a bit more of a nuisance, so he got sent right out of town. And the Morses, they remembered that, especially young Kendall. Now, there was one time now, I think this was around Thanksgiving, while Barney Beal was the governor, and he was due to make a very important decision on how the inhabitants of Washington County were to be taxed. I can't remember the exact details, but of course Beals Island wanted to have a say, and they sent up the Morses as an influential sort of local family in their community. They sent the Morses up to have negotiations. They had a Thanksgiving dinner together up in Machias. So of course they wanted to meet on neutral ground. So families, they met in Machias and they had a dinner there. And Kendall Morse, being so smart, of course, he offered to shoot and butcher and cook up the turkey for that night. And so they were all sitting around waiting for dinner, and Kendall was in the kitchen working his magic. And he was portioning out the turkey. He'd cut it up and portioned it, and he set it about in a very particular way. He had the servings for the different families laid out there. And for the Beals servings, he put out bones and hardly any meat on them. And for his own family servings, he put out all this good meat with the breast and the thigh, all the good cuts of the meat, and he put them on their own plates. But what he did was he didn't just do that, you know. He laid out sort of a trap. What he did was he covered all the bones with the fat of the turkey and all the good fat and that off the birds, so it looked like the Beals had the ideal platter. And then for his own family, he covered it all with offcuts and skin and made it look like the Beals were getting a better deal. Now this might not seem too intuitive at first, but he had his plan, and he went out there and his plan worked well, because Barney Beal, being a politician and all, Barney Beal took one look at that and he spotted some unfairness. He spotted some situation he might be able to make himself look good in. So Kendall was laying out the food, and Barney Beals speaks up and he says, "Them portions there, they don't look too fair. They don't look too evenly distributed." And Kendall Morse, of course, he cracked a bit of a wry smile, and he looked up at Barney and he said, "Well now, that was never my intention, of course. You know, I want things to be fair for this dinner, very important to me. So if you think that this is unfair, why don't you just pick which portions you want? I certainly didn't mean for them to be uneven, so to make up for it, you can pick which ones your family gets." And of course, Barney, not being too bright as he was strategic, Barney took them the good meal there. Took the one that looked good with all the fat on it. And when they started eating pretty quick, that trick was figured out. When Morses had all the good food and all the Beals had was bones, and Barney Beal, he leapt up there, and he was furious with the Morses. He was furious, smashing his fists on the table, standing up. There was the scene that night. And tell you what, Kendall ruined Thanksgiving. Neither family were too happy from then on. And a particular incident happened not long after this, which everyone sort of figured it was his fault, because the Beals didn't quite like the Morses, and Barney Beal didn't like Beals Island. And sort of looked like the Kendall Morse had sort of depreciated the value of Beals Island in the mind of the town selectman and the governor, because not long after, this would have been a few months after, 60s or something, when he was governor, he was putting through all these bills, and it came to a time where he was in charge of distributing the electrical grid when Washington County was being electrified. And so when that was all done, the job was all sorted, he was down in Washington, D.C., away out of town getting all this sorted, and it came to be the townspeople were waiting to see what happened, and eventually the lights turned on, but only in Jonesport, and it looked like Beals Island hadn't been linked up to the grid. And everyone was looking around wondering why one town had electricity and the other didn't, and Kendall figured it was because of the grudge that Barney Beal was holding towards the Morses and towards all the people on Beals Island because of that. Now Kendall, of course, he wasn't going to go down without a fight. There was two options for Kendall. He knew he could either own up and apologize and beg him to put electricity back on the island, but he knew that wasn't going to work, Barney being a stubborn man, and so Kendall had another thought. You know, Kendall never was much of a thief. He wasn't a criminal of any sort, but, you know, I guess you could kind of say he figured out how to steal things that you wouldn't normally think could be stolen. Now, Barney having been away from town for some time, his servant was in charge of the house while he was out, and it came to be that I suppose Kendall figured out some way to trick that servant and got into his private office with all his letters strewn around and his wax seals and his signature all over the place. And Kendall had a bright idea what to do with all of Barney's resources in that office. And it came to be that a few hours after Barney left Washington, D.C. to return home, people of Washington, D.C. must have been mighty surprised when they found a letter from him. Just after he'd gone, he'd written them a letter, and it was signed with his signature, asking for Beals Island to be connected up. And of course they thought, well, there's no reason we don't care about this island, there's no reason for this not to be him, so I will put that through. And Barney got home and he went out to his put his candle out for the night one night, and he realized that the lights were shining in the window a bit more strongly than they had been on previous nights, and he figured something must have been up. So he went out onto his dooryard, sort of had a look around there, trying to figure out what was going on. He looked north, he couldn't see nothing. He looked east, he couldn't see nothing, and then he turned south finally, and he saw lights shining up from Beals Island. And he saw them people with their lights on down there. He saw they'd had their grid hooked up. They'd had electricity while he was out, and he didn't know how that happened. So of course he figured, just as Kendall knew, when Beals Island didn't get electricity, Kendall knew it was because of him, because of Barney. Same thing then, when he saw they had electricity, Barney knew it was because of Kendall. And Barney was downright furious, being furious, of course, most of his life, I suppose. He figured out something to do with Kendall. Of course, went back to the town duties, coming back from Washington, D.C., got back into the employment office. And it eventuated not long after that Kendall ended up having a job building cabins up in Trescott. Now, I don't know if you've ever been up to Trescott. Have you been up that way?
No, I can't say I have.
Well, they've got the highest wind speeds in all of Maine, you know. That's all there is to say. The weather up there is fearsome. I heard one time up there they had a chicken laying eggs into the wind. The chook laid the same egg about 5 times. And every day, Kendall would go out to build this cabin, building cabins for the game wardens and all that up there. And he'd build a cabin, spend the whole day building it up, and by the end of the day, the wind would come by and blow it right down again. And it went that same way every single day. He'd try to do his job, and by the end of the day, his job would get blown right over. There was no end to it, and it went on like that for years. And that, of course, I suppose, was Barney's way of punishing him, sticking him up there in the far reaches of society, seeing if he could withstand that sort of repetitive work every day. And the same thing happening every day. He would build it right up again, and then wind would swoop down and take it right away again. No, that went on for some time. I believe it was after Barney had retired from politics, his son Alfie Beal, it would have been, he became an influential man of his own, and by that point, Kendall, it had been a few years, and he got Kendall out of that job, sent him back to Beals Island where he came from. And by then, I suppose, his son, having freed his enemy, Barney sort of let it all be in the past. Sort of left it all behind him, and I don't think he had much of a grudge against the Mosses on Beals Island after that. And I think to this day, people still say that's the reason that on Thanksgiving, everyone in Washington County has turkey for dinner. They still reckon it's for that same reason, because of what they had on that night up in Machias, what they ate up there. Also say something about that being how Beals Island got electricity in the first place, was because of Kendall's trickery.